Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association, and I'm happy to welcome you to a presentation on the roots of the Ukrainian War. We also welcome our fellow veterans from the Edith Norris Rogers Memorial Veterans Hospital in Bedford, Massachusetts. And we offer a special thank you to Andrea Vinci, recreational therapist. Our fellow veterans at the VA really enjoy participating in these programs, and Andrea makes it all possible. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Brigadier General retired Leonid Kondratiuk. After serving 2 years as a field artillery officer upon graduating from the Citadel, General Kondratiuk joined the Massachusetts Army National Guard as military historian. Soon after, his talents were needed in Washington, D.C. at the National Guard Bureau. He worked as senior military historian for 20 years, taking time out for tours as faculty member at the Army War College and public affairs officer. He retired at the rank of colonel in 1999 and was promoted to brigadier general in 2007. In retirement, General Kondratiuk speaks often about the situation in Ukraine and communicates regularly with family members there. He's a member of the National Lancers and a skilled horseman, and he plays the role of Paul Revere each year on Patriots' Day. And he rides into Lexington on horseback to spread the alarm of the approaching British troops. So please welcome General Leonid Kondratiuk.
Yep, you can hear me. Thank you very much. Let me just talk about briefly what I did since coming back to Massachusetts. I grew up in Dorchester and Rosendale, by the way, now live in Belmont. I head up the National Guard's history programs, veterans records, retirees, the state militia, and veterans. I mentioned a number of things. What I do want to mention, under the Adjutant General's office, which I worked for many years, we have the records of every Massachusetts serviceman and woman from 1775 to yesterday. Over 3.5 million records. No other state has anything like that. That's one of the things that we do. And you say, why is that important? Because all US Army personnel records from 1912 to 1956 were destroyed in a huge fire in St. Louis in 1973. So if you want to do genealogy, if somebody was in the Revolution, World War I, World War II, we have the records in my office. And that'll be my comment on that. So I appreciate being here today. Speaking, I've gone to a number of groups around Massachusetts, of course, the last several months. And I'm going to talk briefly about Ukrainian history. I'm going to show you. There's Ukraine right there, and you can see that it's bordered by a number of different countries on the east and one major country on the west, that is Russia. Just take a look at that briefly, and you'll see some of the key cities on the map behind me and that come up and then used from time to time during the last year or so. Some introductory comments for me as a member of the Boston Ukrainian community. The war in Ukraine, even though it's 4,500 miles away, it's very close to us in the Ukrainian community. There's over 1,000 Ukrainian refugees this part of Massachusetts. 2 weeks ago, I went to visit the Citadel where I graduated from and to greet the Ukrainian cadets there training to be officers of the Ukrainian Army. And then I was getting on the flight going through TSA check. I see a young man in a wheelchair and he stands up and he's wobbly. And I look down, he's got new prosthetic legs. And I look at his hat, he's got the Ukrainian flag on his hat. And I walk up to him, he's a Ukrainian soldier on his way back to Ukraine after getting new prosthetic legs. A month or two in our church at St. Andrew's Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Jamaica Plain, a young girl, 6 years old, came in with her caretaker. She had no legs, her legs blown off. by a missile strike. She was getting new prosthetic legs. She just got them a week or so ago. She's doing well, and she's going to go back to Ukraine in a little while. And then in church, this one got me, if you didn't get the little girl without the legs. A woman came up to our priest and said, "Father, pray for my husband who was just killed in action in Ukraine." So things like this, so, we see this, we see the Ukrainian flags all over the Boston, Massachusetts here, which is great for the support, all the support that's come from just people of the United States going to Ukraine. So that's well appreciated. So Ukraine background, before the war, there were 40 million people. After the war, there was 13 million displaced. 8 million have left Ukraine, there's 6 million internally displaced or so in Ukraine. Ukraine is the largest country in Europe. Bet you didn't know that. Russia doesn't count because it's Eurasian. Ukraine is about the size of Texas. And it is one of the largest producers of wheat, potatoes, and all these other crops. But the wheat that we grow in the United States and the Midwest came from Ukraine. And in the 1870s, a group of Ukrainian immigrants came to Kansas. And when they were leaving the Russian Empire, they were shut down because the Tsar did not want anybody to bring any seeds out of Ukraine. Well, they did. They hid the seeds, and they grew that I was stationed in Kansas for a while. They grew that crop in Kansas, and that was called winter wheat. And that's the wheat that we get from the Midwest to this day. So there's some connections with the United States. It was one of the largest producers of, it's an industrial country as well, and it produced military hardware as well. The wheat, I should have mentioned, is critical to Asia and Africa. And if that wheat doesn't get out of Ukraine, people in South Sudan who are now undergoing a famine are going to have larger problems. So let me go to this next slide. Ancient land, new country. So interesting fact, 3,500 BC, the wheeled cart is invented in what is today Ukraine. And you're going, all right, so what? Well, that's one of the biggest inventions in humankind, because with that wheeled cart, now you could take goods from farms and bring them to a village, a city. So the invention of the cart spread all over Western Europe. Another thing that happened in Ukraine, that these has come from the Yamna tribe of that period. The Indo-European languages that all related, Western Europe, and the Iranian language and languages in India, it's the same tribe that started this root of these languages and brought them with them to the West. Another fun fact, the Scythians invented the idea of stirrups. I'm a rider, you need stirrups to stay on a horse. They got to figure out a saddle is just a cloth, but you make up a saddle and you put the stirrups, now you can stay on the horse, right? And as a result of that, you could fight on horseback. And so for thousands of years, the cavalry was the most important branch in warfare. So Kyiv and Rus is the root of all Ukrainian history. You can see the slide 800 to 1240. And Ukraine was a principality, almost didn't have a king. And the first nobility, if you want to call them that, were Vikings. I am 1% Viking as a result of that. And they were invited in, and they were the leaders of what is today Ukraine, and eventually they became Ukrainized. And this Kyiv and Rus was so large, it encompassed all of what is Ukraine today. It went all the way to the Baltic Sea and a good chunk of Russia. And that's why V.V. Putin, one of the reasons is Territorial wants to come back, wants to take Ukraine. But these Ukraine Rus was so important that two of its princesses became queens of France, and one became the Queen of Scotland. So that was an important country and most important country in that part of Europe. Well, talking about men on horseback, the Mongols come in 1240, invade Ukraine, take it over, and come under the Mongol yoke. And once they fade, other nations come in. And Ukraine has always been fought over. Why? Because of the farmland, the rich natural products that it has within the country, and it's a huge country as well. So you can see Poland came in, took part of, and then Once Russia becomes a country, it takes Ukraine, Austria, and Germany. And Ukraine is independent only for a brief time. You can see 1648 to 1654, the Ukrainian Cossacks defeat the Poles. Ukraine's an independent nation only for a short while. And it needs an ally. Unfortunately, it signs a treaty with Russia, and within years, Russia takes over Ukraine and holds on to it for hundreds of years. During the Russian Revolution, Civil War, 1918, 1921, Ukraine is independent again. But the problem is it's fighting three different armies at the same time. It's fighting the Poles in the west, fighting the Bolsheviks in the north and the east, and fighting the whites in southern Ukraine. And it cannot defeat three armies, and it is defeated. Ukraine now becomes part of the Soviet Union under Lenin. And while Lenin was alive, things were okay. Ukrainians were, by the way, Ukrainians were not, the Ukrainian language was outlawed for hundreds of years because there was this ongoing Russification. The Ukrainian language was prohibited. You couldn't use it in church. No books could be published. And that's why Russian immigrants came in to settle in eastern Ukraine. But nonetheless, the Ukrainian language and culture didn't hang on. And it was encouraged to some degree under Lenin. Now, Stalin comes in. Stalin, I like to tell people that Stalin probably killed more of his people than Hitler killed of the Soviet Union. It was That's maybe a little bit of an exaggeration, but not by much. He puts the thumb on Ukraine. The Russification intensifies. The church is taken out, is banned. And he wants to industrialize Russia. So how does he do this? So he has his henchmen seize all the grain in Ukraine for 2 years, 1933, 1934. As a result, 4 million Ukrainians die of starvation. And the other thing they was doing, Ukrainians, unlike the Russians, they had their own plots of land, they could be their own farmers, and his goal was to collectivize, make these huge industrial farms and get rid of private land that was the other part of it. Many farmers ended up going to Siberia, and that 5 million number probably a little bit more than that, but I'll tell you, every Ukrainian has a personal story about their family. My mother was 7 years old, and there was no food in the house. They were starving. And so her mother, my grandmother, threw her out of the house. And my mother lived in the woods for about 2 months. I don't know how she did, eating whatever she could find in the woods. And she was finally brought back into the home. After the famine, Stalin increased the persecution of Ukrainians as enemies of the state. My grandmother was executed August 28th, 1939. Why do I know that? That's my birthday, 28 August 1949. She was executed as an enemy of the state by the NKVD because they couldn't catch my grandfather, who was a Ukrainian patriot. So they killed her instead. Ukraine lost 10 million dead during World War II. That's another fact. And that's why the population is so small today, because of all these things that have happened in the 20th century. Ukraine is admitted as a member of the United Nations, even though it's part of the Soviet Union. It was a deal. Belarus and Soviet Union and Ukraine all became members. And Stalin died, but the Russification still went on for years and years until finally Glasnost and the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. So that's a brief history of Ukraine. Let's go. What led to war? Well, the number one point is one man started this war, and only one man can end it, maybe. Putin was very upset about Ukrainians getting rid of their presidents twice in a row. In 2004, 2005, there was a revolution, the Orange Revolution. There was an election that wasn't fair, and so a new president was elected. And the same thing happened, well, not exactly the same thing. The president, Yanukovych, became president. And in 2014, there was a revolution in Kyiv, and the pro-Russian president Yanukovych was thrown out, forced to leave. And Putin saw that as an affront to himself, because Yanukovych was pro-Russian. And what really upset the Ukrainians was the Ukrainians are looking to the West. They've always looked to the West, to Europe, to Western Europe. And they wanted to become members of the European Union, and Yanukovych wouldn't let that happen. And so This upset Putin for a number of reasons. One, strategically, he wanted Ukraine as a puppet state under his umbrella, just like Belarus is today under Lukashenko. And he gave this rambling speech 2 years ago. And the thesis was Ukraine as a country does not exist, which is totally ridiculous. Ukrainian language, Russian language, two different cultures. They're close, the same East European Slavic group, but it's not, we've had a different history than them. And you can see what he wants to do is the recreation of the Russian Empire. To him, he says this all the time, the worst thing that ever happened in the 20th century was the fall of the Soviet Union. I would say that's one of the best things that ever happened.
Yes.
And so what does he do? He has a thing for Ukraine now. So the first thing he does is he sends his Spetsnaz, his special forces, into Crimea. Crimea has got an interesting history. It's only part of Ukraine since 1954, but he seizes it, and there's Ukrainians living there, and Tatars. Tatars are our original descendant living in Crimea for centuries. They're Muslims, and there's a good slug of ethnic Russians there as well. He sees it with it's called Little Green Men, Russian army troops with no insignia. And then when the Western media would ask Putin, well, aren't those Russian soldiers? Oh, no, they're not Russian soldiers. Well, they are. Oh, they're just people that rose up. So they're actually regular members of the Russian army. So there's no pushback from the West for seizing Crimea. So the next thing what happens is he says, so he has a plan which he executes in 2015, the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, or like states in Ukraine. And that war begins in 2015, and he takes his attempt is to put puppet states in there, take that part of Ukraine and to see what happens. Again, there's no pushback from the West. And the whole intent is to have a pro-Russian government in Ukraine. I want to talk briefly about the Ukrainian army. In the mid-1990s, I had a mission of setting up U.S. Army relations with the Ukrainian army. It's been ongoing since 1993, but it was a Soviet model till 2015, because that's what they knew. It was organized as a Soviet army. It was trained as a Soviet army. The officership wasn't that good. There were no sergeants in the army. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And as a result of the Ukrainian forces being defeated 2015, 2016. It was a very small army, by the way. It was only 150,000 2015. Starved for resources. They didn't have enough equipment. A lot of the defense budget was being Ukraine was a kleptocracy. The funds were being stolen from, diverted from the defense budget to other areas. People's pocket. As a result, the Ukrainian army did not have modern weapons, and so it was not in good shape. As a result, they turned to the United States and to NATO and says, "Could you help us? We have to reorganize. We're fighting the war in the East, but meanwhile, can you train us up in the West?" So a training center is built in western Ukraine, Yavoriv, not far from the Polish border. And I'm going to talk about the 20,000 junior officers and NCOs by the U.S. National Guard. One of the things we set up in the National Guard is not well known, that the National Guard trains 90 different armies all over the world. Massachusetts, we help train the Paraguayan and Kenyan army. We send training teams there. They're not allies, but they're friends of the United States. And we did this with Ukraine as well. 2015 to 2022, there's been a brigade of the U.S. National Guard station in Ukraine to train the troops, and they've done pretty well. Florida National Guard was the last unit to leave just before the war began, and very successful. The U.S. Army and other also send in trainers. The Green Berets, when the special forces went to train the Ukrainian special forces, they did quite well training them. Canada, Britain, and to a smaller extent, other NATO nations came in and helped train the Ukrainian army. So that by the beginning of the war, the Ukrainian army still was not big, about 200,000. Still equipped with Soviet-era weapons. We would not, the previous administrations refused to send any modern weapons to Ukraine for whatever reasons. Ukrainian army is combat experienced when the war began because they'd been fighting in the east since 2015. And the way they learned from the U.S. Army, from the U.S. National Guard, and from the Western allies, and so on. Mission command, what does that mean? It means that every unit commander has the responsibility and the authority to react what's going on the battlefield, to lead his men and women into combat in that tactical situation. Unlike the Russian army, which does not do that, does the reverse. All orders must come from top down. There is no authority to deviate from the plan in the Russian army. Ukrainian army obviously has very high morale, motivation, and civilian support. Those of you that Vietnam era veterans like me, we didn't have that support during that war, but the Ukrainians have that support. You know, the Ukrainians will fight to the last man and woman, I think. We don't know the current strength of the Ukrainian army. This is just a guess. I'm guessing it's about 600,000. Talk about the Russian army. It was the second largest in the world. And they've had a modernization, reorganization, training, whatever, for the last 10 years. And that whole effort has failed. Their chairman of the Joint Chiefs until recently, General Valery Gerasimov, who is the equivalent of our General Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, now is the overall commander of Russian forces in the Ukrainian war. Anyway, for 10 years, he had, on his watch, he was supposed to reform the Russian army, and it was a complete failure. The training was terrible. They don't use the doctrine that they have. The maintenance, we'll talk about maintenance, just a modernization of everything, complete and utter failure. And the corruption is just terrible. They have Potemkin village barracks. We all know what Potemkin village is, right? These fake villages that were put up. And when there were inspectors coming in, they would only open up a portion of the barracks because the rest of the money for the new barracks had gone into the pockets of the officers. I mean, that one good example. Centralized command all decisions by senior officers, no initiative by company grade lieutenants, captains, and so on. Now, one thing the Russians do have, they do have a lot of artillery. When I was in the artillery, we used to joke about the Russian artillery in World War II because it was so massive, we would say they would hub to hub. The wheels would touch on each side. They had so much artillery in World War II. Well, they still have a lot of artillery. It's become an artillery war, just blowing everything up to smithereens. Large numbers of tanks. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Fighter aircraft. They have the most modern fighter aircraft and helicopters. Well, they got all this stuff, but the Ukrainians are good at shooting these things down. So we'll talk about that as well. One thing that the U.S. Army does extremely well is logistical support. You know, all the supplies, all the maintenance parts, all the equipment, all the beans and bullets and everything else that you need to run an army or fight a campaign. The Russians can't do that. You remember that 40-mile convoy in the beginning of the war that was stuck, trying to get into Ukraine, 40 miles long. They ran out of gas. That's why it didn't move. Now, and to make it worse, the Russian soldiers weren't being fed. So the truck drivers would get out and they would sell their gas to the people in the area so they could eat something. Now, the Wagner Group, I was asked to just talk briefly about that. This is it's run by Yevgeny Prigozhin. It's a private army of mercenaries, was organized like 2014. It's a core group of about 10,000 Russians, professional soldiers, mercenaries, fight for money. They've fought in various countries in Africa. They fought in Syria, I think in Iraq, portions of Iraq. There was a story that U.S. Air Force, we didn't know the Wagner Group was in action on the pro-Assad side in Syria, and apparently we bombed them once. Apparently we should have done it again, but this is the group that's now fighting in Bakhmut, which is the ongoing battle right now, biggest battle now. And you probably saw in the media how this Prigozhin went to all the prisons of Russia and said to the convicts, join up my army, you'll get well paid and well fed. What he didn't tell them, they were going to get well dead too. And that's what happened to them. In the Bakhmut, thousands and thousands of these convicts had been killed. And he was keeping back. So what he would do, we'd send these mass waves of infantry against the Ukrainian machine guns and so on, and other weapon systems. And the convicts would be mowed down. And then behind them would be these professional mercenaries trying to see where the Ukrainians were weakest and attack there. There's an ongoing struggle between the Wagner Group and the Russian Ministry of Defense. The Russian Ministry of Defense sees them as rivals. The Wagner Group has embarrassed the Russian generalship, and as a result, the Russian Army, Russian Ministry of Defense is purposely starving the Wagner Group for weapons and ammo, and using them as cannon fodder in this the struggle that's going on as we speak. Being a military historian and retired Army officer, my talk obviously is driven by the war today. But the U.S. intelligence to the war is critical to the Ukrainians, and it's ongoing. We knew when they were going to invade. We told President Zelensky, they're going to invade. You guys got to get ready. And Zelensky initially said, no, they're not going to invade. Ukraine was not ready, didn't mobilize. And to them, it was a surprise that the Russians did invade. Yeah, it was a 190,000 man army. And Ukraine's first few weeks of the war were way behind the power curve as a result. Zelensky and his generals quickly reacted, but it would have been better if they had been in a better mode prior to the invasion. Nonetheless, they learned quickly. The Russian army, I have advanced on 9 axes of advance into Ukraine. I counted 5, you could count 6, whatever it is. They attacked Ukraine from the north, from the east, northeast, southeast, and from Crimea. And these generals that were leading these advances were not talking to one another. There was no overall commander of all the armies of Russia going into Ukraine, which no army in previous history would have done this, I think, at least in the 21st century. So there's no coordination. The orders are coming directly from Moscow to each general. So the generals on one side, one advance, don't know what the other army is doing on the other side. And that led to some confusion. And there was no coordination between as you can see, from the Army, Navy, and Air Force. I got a little. So the U.S. Army recognizes 9 principles of war: mass, objective, simplicity, security, maneuver, offensive, unity of command, surprise, and economy of force. Putin and his generals violated 5 of these principles. They didn't even follow their own doctrine: how to attack using air assets, how to attack coordinating infantry with artillery, and so on. And they paid for it. There were enough. Even though the 190,000 number of troops that surrounded Ukraine, that was not enough to invade Ukraine and take Ukraine. I talked about the poor logistical support and just the terrible, terrible generalship. The Russian way of war hasn't changed really since World War II. Overwhelming artillery barrage, missile strikes, drones. About a month ago, my cousin Larissa lives in Kyiv. Talked to her on the phone, and I said, "What kind of day did you have?" "Well, it wasn't very good today. I was walking down the street, and all of a sudden, I heard a loud boom, and all this glass shattered all over me." Well, what had happened is a Ukrainian fighter jet had just shot down one of these Iranian drones, and all the missile parts drone parts had come down and shattered the windows and just covered her with glass. And then Ukrainian fighter jet just flies right above her head. So that's a typical day in Ukraine. Attack on civilian infrastructure. You've seen this on TV, but just a bombing of schools, apartment buildings, hospitals, energy plants, deliberate destruction of cities and towns. It'll take 70 years for Ukraine to recover from this. 70 years at least. In Ukraine, by the way, in the cities, there's no private homes. Everybody lives in apartment buildings that were built in the Soviet era. The good news is the Soviet construction wasn't so great, so when they rebuild these things, it'll be better construction, better living quarters, but it's going to take years. The war crimes, just terrible. Destruction of cultural sites, looting, rape, murder, kidnapping of children. The number of children that have been kidnapped in Ukraine, we don't know the exact number. One agency says 6,000, the Ukrainians say 16,000. So these kids are forcibly taken from their parents, from orphanages, shipped to Russia, where they're adopted by good families. What it is, the population rate of Russia is going down, the birth rate is going down. So this is Putin's way to increase the population. Incredible mistreatment of POWs. They're starved, they're tortured. Talking about cities that where murders have taken place. Last night, President Zelensky awarded the Ukrainian Medal of Honor to Alexander Matsievsky. He was the prisoner of war executed that the videos came out last week. He was smoking a cigarette. He had to dig his own grave behind him. That's the Russian style. He stood there, finished the cigarettes, and he said, his last words were, Slava Ukraini, which is glory to Ukraine, and then he was shot. So that's the Russian way of war. Torture, rape, murder of prisoners of war. Against all international law, he took 4 oblasts of Ukraine and made them parts of the Russian Federation. Those parts of Ukraine, they now controls 17%. I'll show you a map in a few minutes. Those people have been forced to become Russian citizens. They've been given Russian passports. They have to speak Russian in their daily lives in school and so on. And that's all part of this Russian way of war. Intense propaganda both for internal and external audiences. So if you do a poll in Russia today, 80% will say, hey, Putin's doing the right thing. He's attacking Ukraine because, listen, the West, the United States, they're going to attack us. So he had to invade Ukraine, and they believe this stuff. And all of this is an attempt to break the will of the Ukrainian people. And it's not going to work. It's not going to work. The Ukrainians are used to privations, to hard times, and that's what they're going through now. So I'll briefly go through the various phases of the war. I'm not going to spend a lot of time just going through it quickly because we need to make time for questions. The phase 1, the Russians advanced, and the most important, the key thing that they want to do in the U.S. Army at the War College, we teach something called the center of gravity. What do we have to do to defeat the enemy and force him to end the campaign, end the war? The center of gravity. What will it take? The center of gravity for Putin was the capture of the capital of Kyiv and the execution of President Zelensky, and put his own people, his own puppets in there. So that advance to Kyiv was critical in the war effort, and it failed. It failed because the Ukrainian army stopped them. It fought man-to-man at the airports. The Ukrainian army wiped out the Russian special forces, wiped out the Russian airborne brigade that went in there, took them out completely, and as a result, that stopped. The payback was the war crimes committed in Bucha and Irpin. President Zelensky rises to the occasion, becomes a great wartime leader in the mold of Churchill, but I will tell you, he's even better than that. He's more of the mold of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was our greatest commander-in-chief. FDR comes in second. Zelensky's is in the running for the Ukrainians as a great commander-in-chief. He's that good, leads the nation. But not only that, he's gone to various, has made speeches to various groups all over the world, and has garnered support for the Ukrainian nation. We're here in Lexington, steps away from Lexington Green, and in March of 2022, the Ukrainian nation has to defend itself. So what do? They create their own militia, just like here in Lexington Green on April 19th, 1775. The Ukrainian militia is organized, made up of untrained men and women that given weapons, and they're told, and with Molotov cocktails, and they were told, get ready to defend the city of Kyiv. Well, that Territorial Guard, made up of untrained men and women, now over 1 year, 13 months of war, had become part of the Ukrainian army, and are now fighting the Russians day to day. So that part-time army, militia army, became a full-time army at some cost, because the hardest way to become a soldier is to learn on the battlefield. Training, Ukrainian excellent command and control, leadership at all levels. Again, they're following the NATO US model on officership. They have excellent special operating forces, SOF, and the ingenuity and the resilience of high morale of the Ukrainians. For example, the US Air Force sent the Ukrainian Air Force F-16 missiles, HARM missiles. They said, we're sending them to you anyway. There's no way you can put this on your fighter aircraft. It's just incompatible. Within a couple of weeks, the Ukrainians figured out how to put a US missile system on a Russian MiG-29 and have shot down Russian fighters. One of the other things is, I should say, the Russians do not have air superiority. What does that mean? They do not control the skies of Ukraine. They're afraid to fly into Ukraine because the US and other allies have provided the Ukrainians with so much air defense weapon systems. And that is a key. If you want to win any war, you got to have air superiority. They don't have it. They're afraid to fly in. So what do when a lot of these missiles are launched by bombers? They're always flying over Belarus or Russia so they can launch. So they don't want to be shot down. Key is U.S., NATO, Russia's ammo and weapons to Ukraine. If it wasn't for all this United States aid that we've been sending over, Ukraine would have been defeated by now. And this is a major operational defeat for the first several months of the war. Putin now has to make some changes. He fires the generals, appoints new commanders. They're just as inept as the previous ones. He has to reorganize, and he launches a new offensive. The Russians don't advance. The Russian army is based on battalion tactical groups, which I could talk about, but they fail as an organization to engage the enemy, make any effort toward the Ukrainians. And one of the things that the Western armies and here in the US is the failure of the Russian army. You know, I was brought up in the Cold War army. I was trained to fight the Russians. And we were told, man, there's gonna be more Russians than you can deal with. They have excellent doctrine weapon systems, and they're gonna overrun. You know, U.S. Army in Germany is going to stand for a couple of days and be overrun, and the Russians will be in France. Well, that's not the case. They do not know how to synchronize their weapon systems. And you can see the bullets. They don't know how to employ the infantry, artillery, armor, that is tanks, air, helicopters, they can't do it. That is basic to any modern type of war. We do that so well in the United States and the other NATO army. They can't do it. They have not learned from their failures. They keep on doing the same stupid things they keep on doing. Ukrainians, on the other hand, tech savvy. I did not know this, but there's a big tech industry in Kyiv. These young men, young women have joined the army, and they know how to run, drones, intercept the stupidest thing. Russian soldiers use cell phones, right? And so do some of the officers. And so the Ukrainians are watching this and said, they know where the Russians are, so what do? They send an artillery barrage and take them out. That's how they got the generals. They killed a number of generals on the slide. And the adaptation and innovation is just tremendous, and one with the NCO Corps. And I should have mentioned that the Russian army does not have sergeants or corporals. The Ukrainian army does, because they were told to do it by the US and they were trained. And you can't run an army without sergeants. The Russian, by the way, I didn't mention this, the Russian army is made up of two different kinds of soldiers. A contract soldier who's enlisted for about 4 or 5 years, paid well, trained fairly well, and conscripts, draftees. Draftees in the Russian army serve 1 year, it used to be 2 years. And so it takes 6 months to learn how to be a soldier. And then it takes 6 months to leave the Russian army because it's so poorly run, you don't get fed. And there's a hazing system in the Russian army. The senior it's a tradition in the Russian army going back 200 years that the senior soldiers beat up the younger soldiers. And they don't want to be there. not the type of army you want to serve in. So I'm going to go through this a little bit. Let's see, phase 3, you want to do, phase 3, Ukrainians forced the Russians to fall back in the northeast. And this is when the Russians really start throwing all the artillery and missile barrages against the Ukrainians, against the, all these civilian sites in order to break Ukrainian will. Then we go into the next phase. Remember the 300,000 reservists? Some of them weren't reservists that were called up. There were the Russian army does not know how to use replacements. What's a replacement? When you lose a battlefield casualty, how do you send a soldier to replace in that unit? The Russians haven't figured that out. So they got 300,000. They got uniforms for them, but they didn't have any weapons for them. There was very little training, and some of these poor guys are sent up and without the training they should have, and they're either killed or wounded. Major victory in Kherson in November under phase 4. This is a big defeat for the Russians. That's why they're trying to fight, hang on to Bakhmut. Keep going here. Front lines are fairly static. Some of the commentators say it's like World War I with the trenches. Yeah, it is like an artillery barrage, but every war is different. And each side falls back, builds new trenches and so on. But for the most part, it was fairly static, but there were a lot of casualties on both sides. And the Ukrainians are rearming, reorganizing. They have soldiers in Germany and United Kingdom training, getting new weapon systems and training for the next offensive. And the key thing, Ukraine needs tanks. It's got these old broken down Russian tanks built in the 1970s. It's captured some Russian tanks. Russian maintenance system is terrible when it comes to anything. They took stocks of Russian tanks that are 40 years old and tried to put them on the battle. They wouldn't even run. Their engines couldn't even turn the engines on. Parts were missing and so on. Again, to show you how inept the Russian army is. But the Ukrainians need modern tanks. They've asked Germany for the Leopard 2. That is the most modern tank in Europe. And Germany sent 14 2 weeks ago. Canada sent 4 2 weeks ago. US says they're going to send some 14 Abrams. And then the US said it's going to take us 2 years to get them there. And really what it was a subterfuge to get the Germans to turn over a larger number of their Leopards. So hopefully those tanks will start arriving. Ukrainians are being trained on it. What Ukraine desperately needs is an armored division or armored brigades. It doesn't have that. And they need that to go on the offensive against the Russians. Should have a map there. It's dated 8, it hasn't changed much. It's 8 March situation. 17% of Ukraine is occupied by the Russians. And the last week, the Russians launched a new type of missile called a Kinzhal missile system. It's hypersonic, flies 5 times the speed of sound. Can you believe that? And they launched those against Ukrainian cities during the last week. And the US is wondering, why are you using weapons that cost you billions to design and build? And probably the reason is the Russians are running out of missiles. Next they're going to be throwing rocks at the Ukrainians. So it tells you they're reaching the end of their supply line as well. We've read in the press where they're trying to buy arms and ammunition from the North Koreans and from the Chinese. I hope they don't. Of course, the Iranians are trying to have a military relationship between Russia and themselves. They're not friends of the US, as we know. Next slide is one of my favorites there. Ukrainians are tough soldiers. This is a recent release 2 weeks ago from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Look at they claim that they killed and wounded 146,000. The Western media says closer to 200,000. You can see all the tanks, armored fighting vehicles, artillery guns destroyed, and so on and so on. My favorite story, the warship, remember the Moskva in the beginning of the war? The fleet, the admiral of the fleet of the Russian fleet in the Black Sea, his flagship was called the Moskva, which is Russian for Moscow. And Ukrainians rigged up a naval anti-missile system on the shores of not Crimea, near Odessa. and sunk the ship. The newest ship in the Russian Navy, they sunk it. What a humiliating blow. And too bad the admiral didn't go down the ship. Unfortunately, a lot of Russian sailors went down. And the Russians explained to their relatives, oh, there was a mechanical problem, sorry. Look at this slide. Bradley is an armored fighting vehicle. An APC is an armored personnel carrier. We took out old stocks of APCs from the National Guard and shipped them to Ukraine. The key howitzer is the 160 M777s, which we have in the National Guard here in Massachusetts. A tremendous gun system, modern, can hit easily targets 30 miles away. The other key weapons, I didn't talk about the Stingers. Stingers take out helicopters, and I've seen a Ukrainian soldier shoot down a drone with a Stinger missile. That has never happened in military history. And shot down fighter aircraft. It's meant to shoot down helicopters. But these javelins are the missile systems that take out Russian tanks, destroy Russian tanks. And what it does, it flies up, then it comes down into the turret. Inside, comes into the turret, right down. There's no way, that takes out the tank and the crew. A couple of weeks ago, one Ukrainian soldier took out 5 tanks in about 20 minutes. Using this javelin system. He stopped an entire Russian company, took them out. There's the anti-aircraft missile systems there that are listed. I get questions about the T-72 tanks. The United States bought Russian tanks from Poland and gave them to the Ukrainians. That's all they got there. Helicopters that the US bought for the Afghan Air Force were transferred to the Ukrainians instead. Humvees, you know what Humvees are. Russian failures. Putin misjudged the NATO response and the US weapon systems and resolve. Major, major defeat for him, and as well as not taking Kyiv. Zelensky is still in power, rallying the Ukrainians all over the world. Strategic and operational failures by Russian generals. 9 senior generals fired, 12 or more general officers killed in action. Failure to lead, reform, root out corruption in the Russian army led to battlefield defeats. I'm a historian, I'm not a futurist, but we can have some questions. And I just want to finish up with this quote from General Hertling. To me, he's the best commentator on the Russo-Ukrainian war. He's usually on CNN, and you can read what he said. He's also, by the way, the head of the American Battlefield Monuments Commission, which is in charge of all the US cemeteries all over the world. A great American. So with that, I finish my briefing, my comments. Thank you for your attention, and Linda will go to questions.
Where is Bob? I will take this half of the room. Bob will take that half, and our friend Matt will take Zoom questions. Okay, so it looks like, and by the way, if you have a question, please wait until we hand you the microphone. You need to speak into the microphone.
You were eloquent in discussing the American support for the microphone. You were eloquent in discussing American support for Russia. Ukraine. I'm sorry, Ukraine. Equally effective is every little bit of Europe has stepped up to the plate. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania.
Luxembourg, Belgium.
Exactly. And all of these guys are just waiting for the Marshall Plan at the end of the war. They're all excited about going in and rebuilding the country. The news is in the New York Times every day about what they're hoping to be able to contribute. Not necessarily contribute now, but when the war is over, they're ready to step up to the plate and rebuild the place.
You know, that's not my forte. I hope that is the case, because as I said, we all see on TV numbers of Ukrainian cities just leveled. And so they will need a Marshall-like program to rebuild.
Question from over here then?
Hello? Just a quick question on this whole thing is, it's great to see Russia get their rear end kicked, but are they learning anything that they may come back? I mean, I think of like the Spanish Civil War, you know, for the Nazis and everything they learned. Are these Russians learning anything to come back and bite us in the rear end or something?
Apparently not.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. I hope you're right.
So am I. But I think I am.
Okay, let's take a question from our Zoom audience. Matt.
So there's a question that says, Elon Musk provided means for the Ukrainians to use his satellite communication system, Starlink, then recently withdrew access. Has that been resolved? How and what alternative communications do the Ukrainians have?
Yeah, my understanding that that system is still in place. Mr. Musk has reversed his decision, so it's still there and the Ukrainians are still using it. It's a great communication system.
Thank you. I wouldn't underestimate the resiliency of the Russian army and nation. Witness Sweden, Napoleon, and the Germans. So with that aside, two questions. Why does it take 2 years to get an Abrams tank into the Ukraine when it took us probably less than 3 months to get them into Kuwait? That's one question. Second is, how do you eliminate the Black Sea Fleet? Because that would be a message.
Well, for the first question, the reason why we even offered up the Abrams, the administration did not want to give, and the Pentagon did not want to give Abrams to Ukrainians was because this was a modern weapon system the Ukrainians could maintain. It uses a different kind of fuel, uses jet fuel as opposed to diesel or whatever. And it was just too advanced a weapon systems for the Ukrainians to maintain. That was the official line, right? And so we convinced the Germans, but the Germans wouldn't give their Leopards to the Ukrainians unless the United States reciprocated. So we offered up, as I mentioned, 15 tanks. Well, that's nothing. That's only a company's worth of tanks. The battalion has 54 tanks. And those tanks are sitting in Germany. They could be easily advanced. I can't, obviously I'm a retired officer, and I can't speak for the administration, but as of last week, the administration and Department of the Army are now looking for ways to send those tanks sooner. They were saying they were going to build these tanks. Well, the plant is not even operating. So to me, it was not quite on the up and up. As a Black Sea Fleet, this is a land war right now. It's a larger land war. I don't see what the advantage would be with taking out a Russian fleet at this point.
Okay, next one, Brigadier.
Thank you very much. Who has the advantage of time in your estimation?
The Russians.
Thank you. Can I have a follow-on to that? Why then, and I know this is an administration issue, but why are we slow stepping? Our support for the Ukrainian army. If Russia has the advantage of time, we should be putting everything in there that we can, and that's not happening.
I see that as a political issue more than a military issue. Everything that the Ukrainians have asked for, they had to beg, and eventually they did get the weapon system, not in a quantity they wanted or needed. And this is going on with the F-16s and some of the advanced missile systems and missile systems that launch into Russia, 130 miles, the ATACMS. And it's an administration thing. You'll see Admiral Kirby from the NSC go on TV and say, well, we don't want to give it to them because, we don't want to antagonize the Russians, da-da-da-da-da-da. Well, they need the stuff, they need the equipment now, not later. Time is not on the Ukrainian side.
All right, next, Roger.
One comment and one question. The comment is, I don't understand how the U.S., as a member of NATO, can have tanks that are incompatible with the NATO tanks, which are they're diesel-driven, the German ones are, and the U.S. ones are on jet fuel, the Abrams tank. seems like that's a strategic failure on the part of the US dealing with NATO.
Every nation wants to build its own weapon systems.
I know, but that's a mistake. We learned that during World War I and World War II when it came to bullets. Second question, you may have mentioned this about Crimea, and maybe you didn't. It seems to me Crimea plays a strategic part in this war, and there's a real bargaining chip for the Ukrainians to retake that area and then negotiate with the Russians. That's my thought. I'm going to have you any thoughts on that?
I agree, I think the Ukrainians want to take Crimea back, but they want to take the 4 oblasts that are partially occupied by the Russians right now. But the plan is to take Crimea. I don't know if they have the wherewithal, the capability to take Crimea. I see it as a more symbolic and historical thing, and we want all of Ukraine back. I don't agree it's quite a strategic area. But that's not to say the Ukrainians shouldn't take back their own land or their own, Crimea was an autonomous republic. They could run their own affairs to a great extent without Kyiv's direction. But what's happened, many of the Ukrainians and Tatars have moved out because they're being persecuted, and Putin has sent in thousands and thousands of Russian civilians to live in their homes. So it's going to be an issue in the future, how Ukraine's going to deal with that.
All right, let's go back to Zoom. I think Matt has another Zoom question.
Yeah, there was one more, and I think you kind of touched on it, but 6 months or so ago, this person had read that the Ukrainians had killed 10 Russian generals and 100 colonels. What is the tally now?
Yeah, I don't keep count, but that's probably an accurate statement right there. I will tell you, I think the Russian generals have learned not to be on the front lines and not to use their cell phones, as many of the Russian soldiers have learned. But the generals in the front, they were their better generals. They're dead, and the inept one's been sent back to Russia. So hopefully this will continue to lose more generals one way or the other through ineptness and death.
There is one more from Zoom. How soon will war crimes trials begin, and who will conduct them? Yeah,
I don't see any war crimes trials. And how are you going to get these thugs out of Russia? How are you going to get Putin? How are you going to arrest Putin and his generals? There's no way. The odd one may slip out somewhere into the West, but I don't see this happening, if ever.
I have a question that maybe goes back a little ways, but I'm not very smart when it comes to war, and I'm not a veteran. But I'm thinking about the infamous phone call between Trump and Zelensky back when he said he was going to refuse to send the money unless they started an investigation into Pence's son. So
Biden's son.
Biden's son.
Right.
And I want to know what you think. Number one is, did it have any effect on Putin's thinking about the war? Or would it, it's the first time I ever heard of Ukraine, in the modern sense. So what would have happened if Trump had been reelected? I know that's speculation, but.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Trump hates Ukraine. He hates Ukrainians. In his mind, he thought the 2016 computers that were being used to vote against him, that computer system was in Ukraine. The funds that he held back were voted by Congress, and a president has to execute every year. And the funds wasn't a check, but what it was a credit card for Ukrainians to buy weapon systems. And so the Trump administration and the previous Obama administration did not send weapons to Ukraine. And was this a signal to Putin? Yeah, it might have been.
Question, how much is our peacetime economy slowing down the production of what Ukraine needs? Can we meet the production quantities that are needed, or are they constricted by, like I said, a peacetime economy?
So they are constricted. The Department of the Army owns all the factories that makes ammunition. And in some cases builds weapon systems. They're owned by the Army and they're run by contractors. So there's big ammunition plants in Pennsylvania and I believe Iowa. They've ramped up production for artillery shells and they can't keep up with the demand of the Ukrainians. I mean, this is an artillery war, as you can see on television. Everybody's launching artillery shells at one another at a tremendous rate. And so that's an issue for the Ukrainians, that they're not going to have as many as artillery shells to lob over. Neither are the Russians. They're beginning to run out as well. So it's not less of a peacetime economy, but not spending money on plants that were built during World War II, that were operating 24 hours and were everywhere in the United States. And that is the problem. You know, Europe's having the same problem. Should they build a new plant to make ammunition? Well, why build a new plant? Because the old ones are closed, when maybe the orders for these artillery shells are going to run out a year or 2 years from now. So that's the problem we're faced with, the United States and Europe. So it's a serious issue.
With spring coming, I see a phase 5, using your phases there, as they talk a lot about the counteroffensive by the Ukrainians to break the land bridge, essentially go after Melitopol and break the conduit between Crimea and Donbass. How viable do you think that is?
See if I can find that map. So, you know, I can't speak for the Ukrainian General Staff, but it would seem to me this area, see where the city of Zaporizhzhia is there on the map? That portion of the battlefield, that's the Zaporozhian Oblast, next to the Kherson Oblast. It would seem to me that's where the Ukrainians would launch their spring offensive. With the tanks they're getting from Britain and Germany. It's a question of time. Can they get the tanks? Can they train up? Can they get the ammunition? And with tanks, for every tank, you need a squad of infantry. They can't go by themselves. They have to work together. So the Ukrainians have to synchronize as well. And that's an issue.
But if all the weapons that have been promised, the tanks and so forth, would they be in time to do this?
My estimation, I don't think so. I mean, I just told you, the Germans just sent them 14 tanks and the Canadians sent them 4. Britain's going to send them 12. So I think that's your answer.
This may be a little premature, but the word negotiation, have there been any, do you think? And when might there be some?
Well, there really haven't any. And Zelensky was interviewed by Wolf Blitzer the other night, 2 nights ago, and he said he has no plans to negotiate with Putin. Will that day come? Yeah, of course. Every war ends. We don't know how it's going to end. But obviously there's going to have to be some negotiations in the future. By the way, the estimate is that the Russians can fight this war for another 2 years.
In the early days of the war, there was a lot of concern expressed, rightfully, I think, about technical nuclear weapons and whether they would come into play. What's your assessment of that risk going
Well,
ahead?
yeah, Putin was saber rattling, and President Biden, counter-threatened him. The Russians aren't going to use tactical nukes, and if they do, they'd cut their own heads off. A tactical nuke, by the way, is something you use on the battlefield. It takes out an enemy brigade or a division or whatever. The radiation lasts a bit, but you can. Most armies are trained how to deal with that, but it is a serious issue. But I don't see him employing nuclear weapons. The Ukrainians, by the way, gave theirs up. They gave theirs up in the I forgot the name of the agreement. Minsk agreement, I was gonna say that, yeah, thank you. And they, Ukrainians said, take all the nukes, we don't want to be a nuclear power. US said, okay, we guarantee your sovereignty. The Russians said, okay, we signed up, yeah, we guarantee your sovereignty. So, piece of paper, it's like Chamberlain had 1938.
This may be a terrible thought or question for some people, but I just found a book called The First Conspiracy, and there was a group trying to kill George Washington. And so I'm wondering, is there a conspiracy that we don't know about to eliminate Putin from the equation of success?
No, I would tell you, you know, the way Soviet leaders are replaced, either they die of old age, or they're taken out, you know, they're just sent to retire. I don't see that happening. I mean, everybody's going to die eventually, but hopefully Putin will die sooner than, anyway. No, there's no conspiracy that I can see that's viable. We got a report a couple of weeks ago. He refuses to fly on his presidential aircraft because he could be shot down. So he very rarely leaves the Kremlin, by the way. When he does, he travels by armored train. It's harder to take out an armored train than it is an aircraft. So, yeah, and it was a great story going around, a rumor going around back in October that Putin was walking down the steps of the Kremlin and he tripped and he shot himself, and showing that he had health problems. Well, yeah, it was just a rumor. Didn't happen. Probably didn't happen.
Have U.S. military analysts been surprised by the performance of the Russian army?
Yes, and also by the Ukrainian army. Pleasantly surprised the Ukrainians. But yes, that was, I didn't hear this, but commentators say, oh yeah, we thought the Ukrainians would fold in a week and the Russians would be there. So yes, we are surprised by the incompetence of the Russian army, and pleasantly surprised with the performance of the Ukrainian army. But it's all a matter of training. That's what it is. Training, resilience, the will to fight, morale. Russians don't have that. Ukrainians do. Fighting for they are fighting for their wives and children, and their neighbors, just like our militiamen here in Lexington and Concord did. Same thing.
Back to Zoom, Matt.
We have two questions. If the Russian military is opposed to the Wagner Group, who's paying them in Ukraine?
Putin.
And then the other question is, Russians have lived in Ukraine for generations, and at the minimum they are Ukrainians. How many of them have been trained in the Ukrainian army?
How many Ukrainian citizens of Russian background are in the Ukrainian army? I don't know. We know in those two oblasts, Luhansk and Donetsk, many of these so-called Ukrainian citizens joined their little Russian forces. So if you self-identify as a Russian, you're going to join the Russians. Although there is a Russian battalion in the Ukrainian army staffed by Ukrainian officers. Some of them are ethnic Russians, have come over to join. Others are Russians, as the questioner asked. They were all vetted and proven to be true volunteers, and they're in combat as we speak. As a number of Ukrainian legionnaires from all over the world are fighting in Ukraine as well.
Doesn't it look like the Russians are going to be able to take out the power plant?
Zaporizhzhia power plant?
Yes.
Yeah, they control it. They can take it out anytime they want.
They're cutting off power to almost, emergency generators are now.
Well, to keep it going, yeah, to keep it going. Yeah, the Russians control it. So.
And you think they're going to keep it controlled?
I mean, nobody wants another Chernobyl, right? But the Russian, it's a very strange occurrence. It's probably the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, the one in Zaporizhzhia. And the Russians claim the Ukrainians were firing into it with their artillery. Why would the Ukrainians want to do that? So, but the UN was there, they left, and it's still a very, very sticky situation as to what's going to happen there.
I'd like to ask you a question. Getting back to comparing President Zelensky to Abraham Lincoln. In a conversation you and I had, you mentioned that you thought Abraham Lincoln was a better general than any of his generals.
I did say that, yeah, except,
You did.
yeah, with the exception of Grant at the end.
And that President Zelensky was a really quick leader, a quick learner. Would you just talk a little bit more about his quick learning?
Yeah, there's a new book just published last week, published next week. I haven't read it. It's called The Zelensky Method, as to his leadership skills. But I can tell you now, you probably know this, Volodymyr Zelensky was a comedian. I used to watch, my wife and I would watch his TV show, Servant of the State, where he played a history teacher accidentally becoming the president of Ukraine. Well, that actually happened. It wasn't an accident. It was something like 80% of the population voted for him. But, you know, I've seen photographs of him prior to the war as president and now, and you can see the change, like President Lincoln, how he changed in 1861 to the haggard look with the beard and all that. The war has aged President Zelensky as well. And does the acting skills come into play? Well, yeah, we're all actors, aren't we? And I probably, but it's risen him to that level of world statesmanship, I think, at a time that the Ukrainians needed somebody like that. And, you know, the Ukrainians love him. You know, he'll be reelected again. All the presidents prior to him, they couldn't stand him. So, yeah, he's Lincoln-esque.
Angela and I were chatting just before the program started. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to ask you to say a few words, because you are one of our Ukrainian.
Half Ukrainian. My mother was Ukrainian.
Her mother was Ukrainian. She's half Ukrainian. So I thought, just tell us a little bit about just your background.
Okay. My grandmother left Austria-Hungary Empire to go to Canada to make a dowry to return to the Ukraine, to Austria, to get married. World War I happened. World War I happened, and she never returned. My mother was born in Winnipeg.
Yeah, that's a typical story. A lot of the Ukrainians that came to Canada, the United States in the 1880s, 1890s, what they wanted to do is make a few dollars in order to go back to Ukraine. That's Western Ukraine, we talked about that, and to buy a little farm. And we have people in the Ukrainian community that were born in the United States and their parents went back to Ukraine and were caught in World War II. But most people that came to Canada, the United States, they said, hey, this is pretty good, we're not leaving.
Any other Ukrainian people who'd like to just say what their family history is? Marion, all right, we have time for a couple of more questions. Here's Marion.
This is probably simplistic. What would it take for Ukraine to win? What do we have to do?
Well, that's a good one. Well, the one scenario is not going to happen. You know, U.S. fighter jets fighting cover, that's not going to happen. That was ruled out way in the beginning by President Biden. We're not going to employ U.S. troops there. So what it'd take for the Ukrainians would be more arms and ammunition and more death and destruction. I mean, eventually the war has to end. We don't know how. The Ukrainians are hoping for a victory. I don't know. It's a toss-up.
One last question. Hang on. You're it.
Mine is more a comment than a question, and I am Ukrainian, and I've only come here in 1990, so probably not the most recent, but more recent wave of immigration. But one thing that I'd like to say that I have relatives there and I speak to them every single day, and thank you very much for this presentation, because not only it so well reflects what's going on with the deeper understanding of the country, but also it helps everybody to understand it. I do hear some sentiment about why, what are we even doing there? So this has just answered that question beautifully. But one thing that I just wanted to say, I will not be exaggerating if I said almost every time I speak to my either relatives or classmates or friends or neighbors, I hear thank you. And that thank you, and they say, whenever you can do it, please pass that thank you to American people. And I am not exaggerating. They are so grateful. And when the victory comes, not if, but when, America is going to be held on a high pedestal, because it is America's leadership that helped the Europe to unite, and just it's in every Ukrainian's heart today. And I personally, sincerely say thank you, but it is the sentiment of every Ukrainian person.
Thank you.
Any more from anyone? It's not quite clear what the real NATO commitment is to this. Just a few years ago, Germany didn't think they had to spend any money on hardware. And their army is less than some of our police forces. So can you comment at all on how committed you think the rest of NATO is?
You know, NATO is made up of 24 different countries, and each one is different. I mean, of course, you can see the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, France, now Germany, Poland, and Lithuania and the Baltic republics stepping up way beyond their weight. And Germany's finally within Germany there's a big. The government has reluctance to support Ukraine initially, but the people of Germany have demonstrated and have told their leadership, now is the time to rise up and aid the Ukrainians, and they're doing that. Germany is doing that. You know, Germany always had a resistance on having a large army, a trained army. It does not, but has announced within the last several weeks that it will increase the amount of money spent on defense within their GNP. So it's not uniform, but everybody, I think NATO is doing something. Turkey sending drones, and every country has sent something at least. And Ukraine needs this. So yeah, Germany is stepping up to the plate, maybe a little bit reluctantly, but it's doing it. And I think other NATO countries are following. That's the best I can answer your question, Jim.
Is the microphone working? No? All right. Let me just, is this working? Yes. To our Ukrainian neighbor and friend, thank you. Thank you so much for your heartfelt words. And we all agree that any effort that the United States is putting into this we're saving democracy. We're doing this for the international community, for the world, and we do it happily, and we do it gratefully. And we thank you very much for being here today and for your comments. And we only wish the best. Everybody, give me a big hand for our wonderful speakers. Thank you very much for your attendance here today. It's been a great afternoon. This concludes our presentation. See you, we hope, next month, April 10th, for a revolutionary session. Thank you so much and good afternoon.